Thank you everyone for joining us. I am absolutely delighted to be here. I'm Sadiah Qureshi, and today we have our keynote from Professor Ursula Heise. Many of you will know her absolutely stunning work in many respects, but I would just want to kind of recap because I'm just so delighted about this. Professor Heise is currently chair of the English department at UCLA and holds the Marcia H chair in literary studies. She's co-founder and interim director of the Lab for Environmental Natural Studies strategy at UCLA's Institute for the Environment and Sustainability. Many of you will know her research and teaching focuses on contemporary literature and the environmental humanities, spanning environmental literature, the arts and cultures in the Americas, Germany, Japan, and Spain. Literature and science fiction, and narrative theory. Her books include, among others, A Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, and Imagining Extinction, The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, one of my favorite books on extinction, which won the 2017 Book Prize for the British Society for Literature and Science. She's also co-editor of the Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities and editor of the series Nature's Culture's Environment with Palgrave, and co-editor of the series Literature and Contemporary Thought with Routledge. And she's also producer and writer of Urban Ark Los Angeles, a documentary created as a collaboration of Lens with that's LENS with the public television station KCET-Link. So immensely talented, wide-ranging work. And today I'm absolutely delighted and overjoyed to welcome her to give her keynote, Zoöpolis, Urban Narrative and the Animal. Over to you, Professor Heise.
Thank you so much, Sadiah, for this generous and detailed introduction. And I'm so glad that Imagining Extinction has proven of some use for your own work. And I would love to hear about everybody else's work on animal studies, which is, along with environmental humanities, one of my big areas of interest. It's great to be here and great to meet all of you. I hope that I will meet you in person at some point, either here in the United States or over in Europe. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet you at least digitally. And I've found that over the last year and a half, that's actually been very productive and fun to meet people who I haven't never yet encountered in person, but who I hope to work with and talk to in the future. So let me share my screen with you. Just a minute here. Oops, sorry.
We create.
Just a minute, that was the wrong start. Just a second. Here we go. Here we go. So I wanted to begin with a story about animal loss and restoration that was written by the Swiss writer Frank Hohler and was published in 1982. It's called Die Rückeroberung, the Reconquest, and it starts like this. One day, when I sat at my desk and looked out the window, I saw that an eagle had landed on the TV antenna of the house across the street. So that sounds like a fairly banal start, but soon ever more eagles join the first one, and they are followed by an enormous number of deer that make traffic in this unnamed city totally collapse. Then a pack of wolves comes in, then a bear. And when a wolf attacks and kills a boy, panic erupts in the city. A crisis committee opens the hunt on all the wild animals. But it turns out that it's too late. The animals cannot be displaced anymore, and the humans either have to adapt in some way to their presence or leave the city, as many of them end up doing. So the story ends with a narrator sitting in the same place at his desk and reflecting like this: the house across the street is empty, and I sit here and consider whether it still makes sense to leave the city or whether all this is just the beginning of something that will unstoppably spread from here. So that story builds on the tension between the narrator's melancholy and what many might consider environmentally a joyful event, or maybe wishful thinking. A nature so powerful that it will overcome the forces of urbanization and retake cities, overcoming all of the human resistance. The underlying assumption here, though, is that cities and their humans are fundamentally nature's antithesis. So at the end, it's either humans or animals, city or forest, but the two can't exist together. If Hula's story sounds a bit out of sync now, 40 years after its publication, it's, I think, for two reasons. The idea that nature is powerful enough to come back and restore what humans have altered is even less credible today than it was in the 1980s. Now that every high schooler and everybody, for that matter, who reads a newspaper knows about irreversible changes that have been brought about by deforestation, pollution, species extinction, and climate change. And the underlying assumption that humans are separate from nature and that cities are nature's opposite has come in for so many kinds of criticism that it seems even more questionable why a city would not be able to accommodate and even welcome a return of wildlife. I mean, in a lot of cities, this would be exciting, right? So I'd like to approach the question of loss and restoration of animal life today through these kinds of imaginations and narratives of the contemporary city. Urbanization, as I'm sure you're aware, is one of the most salient characteristics of the Anthropocene. Already, more than half of the global population lives in cities today, and that's projected to go up to 70% by the middle of the century. So you see that on the slide here on the blue line in the middle of the graph, which is the global population, and the other colored lines represent different continents. And as you can see, it's the urban population is projected to go up most steeply in Africa and Asia. This is another graph that represents the same developments, shows in a sort of chiasma the decline of rural populations as a share of the world population and the rise of urban populations. So as a consequence of these developments, some urban ecologists and activists argue that the city is humans' major habitat for the future. And urban nature will be the first, and for many humans, the major, even the only way in which they encounter nature. For both of these reasons, they argue, paying attention to our animal and plant fellow citizens is a crucial task now and in the future. So today, through the concepts of Zoöpolis and multi-species justice, I'd like to go a step further down this argumentative road. Because cities are growing in many parts of the world, they encroach more and more on the habitat of other species, including species that don't per se live in the city. And their ecological impact reaches farther than that, impacting even ecosystems that are geographically quite remote from urban centers. So that's why it's important to imagine cities that open up as much habitat as they destroy and that compensate for the displacement of some species by becoming sanctuaries for others. So these are the visions that I'd like to pursue today through scientific and non-scientific narratives about urban animals. So here's sort of the roadmap. In part two, I'll begin with a few historical remarks about the rise of the sanitary city in the 19th century and the changes it implied for animal life, and then segue to a first set of stories about the modern metropolis that typically characterize it as a biodiversity wasteland. In the third part, I'll show how that narrative has changed over the last 30 years with explosively growing interest in urban ecology, green urbanism, and biophilic design among biologists, architects, urban planners, landscape architects, and so on, all of whom seek to reintegrate animals as well as plants into an urban landscape that is now perceived to have too few of them. In the fourth part, I'll briefly zero in on scientific approaches to cities as ecosystems of their own that are different from other ecosystems, so novel ecosystems, as some biologists call them. And these approaches then open up new ways of thinking about the place of animals in the city. Zoöpolis, a term that the geographer Jennifer Walsh has coined, is a way of thinking about the rights and welfare of animals in the city. And multi-species justice, the term that I developed in the book that Sadiah mentioned, Imagining Extinction, focuses on the questions of justice that this kind of Zoöpolis entails. In the last part, I'll zero in on the idea of the modern city as an urban ark, a sanctuary for endangered species, not all of whom are necessarily native to the region. And that sort of, I will talk a little bit about the film that, that Sadiah mentioned that we made 3 years ago. And that idea, seeks to counteract losses of biodiversity and bioabundance in cities as part of the broader effort to slow the global rates of species extinction that we're currently witnessing. So let me start with the wasteland stories. In a variety of cultures, the contrast between city and countryside stands as a proxy for the more general distinction between culture and nature, as Raymond Williams and Haruo Shirane have shown for the English and Japanese traditions. So as a consequence, cities are often envisioned as the antithesis of nature. So it's the place where you go to seek shelter from what's unpleasant or dangerous about nature, or it's the place that you need to escape from if you want to be in touch with nature. As far as animals are concerned, there is a grain of truth to this, at least for cities in the global north. Urban historians, and I'm thinking here of people like Chris Philo, Peter Atkins, many others, many types of animals that used to be common in urban Europe and North America disappeared as a consequence of technological change and efforts to make cities more hygienic. But these animals are still common in cities in a lot of other parts of the world, in major metropolises, cities in Africa, certain parts of Asia, and certain parts of Latin America. So horse-drawn carts and donkeys used as beasts of burden were replaced by cars, buses, trams, and trucks. Livestock markets and slaughterhouses were moved to the outskirts of the city because the close proximity of agricultural animals gradually came to be seen as a health hazard and also as a moral hazard. Some 19th century Londoners thought it was bad for children's morals to witness a cow and a bull have sex on their way to school. Struggles against various species considered pests also displaced animals, so the success there is more varied. Most cities in the global north have lost a great deal of their insect biodiversity, but other so-called pests like rats, mice, and pigeons continue to flourish. So these developments overall probably diminish the overall number of animals in European and North American cities, although you also have to consider the simultaneous rise of pet animals to almost universal popularity in these countries. So that introduced a whole different type of animal life into cities, and it's not easy to tally what the overall numbers might be. Today, it is common for the city to be seen as a space designed and built by humans for the exclusive use of humans. And then, so in that view, this older view that humans and cities are in some sense outside of nature continues to resonate. Ecological science has to a certain degree also contributed to that perspective. One common understanding among ecologists today is that cities are biodiversity wastelands. Now, what scientists mean by that is not that cities are either poor in animals or plants in terms of numbers, or even that they're poor in species diversity. On the contrary, one interesting thing is that a lot of ecologists readily admit that in many cases, cities actually have greater species diversity than the surrounding ecosystems in the countryside. Why? Well, because humans have brought plants and animals from so many different places with them to the city that the diversity is actually quite considerable. So that ranges from exotic flowers in our gardens to introduced trees along our streets, and of course, a wide range of human cultivated variants of dogs, cats, birds, and fish that we keep as pets. But all that biodiversity isn't usually counted in ecology because it's not native. That's a general tendency in biodiversity conservation. The only species that are considered to form part of biodiversity are those that were not cultivated or introduced by humans. Those that are considered disturbances to native biodiversity because they displace native species and, or at least so the argument goes, they resemble each other in cities across the globe. The massive disturbances created by city growth not only destroy the habitat of native species, but they create habitat for relatively few non-native species that are adapting to urban and suburban conditions. This process of replacing localized native species with increasingly widespread non-native species promotes biotic homogenization on several spatial scales. Non-native species may enrich local biodiversity, but global biodiversity is decreased by the subsequent extinction of local native species that are lost to the global species pool. So this is an argument by a prominent biologist who's written extensively about urban biodiversity, Michael McKinney. And it equates urbanization with biotic homogenization and biotic homogenization with biodiversity loss. And that's one of the very, very common, one of the most common arguments about how urban spaces function ecologically. Or at least it was. Over the last 3 decades, other arguments have also been proposed, and I'll get to those in a minute. But that scientific opposition between city and biodiversity and between city and animal life also underlies literary narratives. And that sort of makes sense when you consider the cultural traditions that I mentioned earlier that also underwrite that perception. So take, for example, Lydia Millet's novel, How the Dead Dream from 2008. So the protagonist is a real estate developer, and at a certain point he loses his lover in a car accident. And that loss then gradually attunes him to the greater biological losses that the construction of ever more sprawling subdivisions in California generates. He becomes obsessed with final animals, the last of their species, and he actually burglarizes zoos at night, breaks into the enclosures to spend a night with a final animal. And gradually, he turns into an environmentalist and conservation advocate, which in the logic of this novel also means that he has to abandon his real estate business. So once again, it's either animals or city building, but not both. But over the last 3 decades, a different urban narrative has begun to compete with the idea of cities as biodiversity wastelands. Starting in the 1990s, the fields of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and design have generated a profusion of theoretical paradigms and practical applications. And I've put a bunch of those on the slide here for you. So labels such as green urbanism, landscape urbanism, urban political ecology, and biophilic design. So what these approaches try to do is they try to draw attention to the many forms of urban nature, sometimes by relying on community science, and also to foster the creation of more and more equitably distributed nature for cities. So they advocate for river and lake cleanups, park creation, urban farming, green roofs, wildlife corridors, and ecological restoration, to name just a few examples. Now, these approaches are extremely wide-ranging and sometimes incompatible with each other in their underlying theories and practices. But I think it's fair to say that they do share at least 2 basic arguments. One, that the city is habitat for more and for more diverse life forms than we usually assume. And 2, that access to green spaces and biodiversity is in many cases just simply insufficient and unevenly distributed. So one consequence for these practitioners and theorists is that architects and planners need to integrate green spaces and questions of access to nature into their work. So these perspectives have implied a shift away from the idea of the city as the opposite of nature and as the habitat of just one species. And there's perhaps no clearer sign of the deep inroads that this new way of looking at cities has made over the last 2 decades than the fact that David Attenborough, who, as you know, has documented wildlife in the most diverse and remote ecosystems around the world since the 1950s, decided to include cities in his 2016 series, Planet Earth 2. Episode 6 of that series focuses on urban wildlife. So langurs in Jodhpur, India, bowerbirds in Townsville, Australia, and spotted hyenas in Harar, Ethiopia, for example, are animals that show up in that documentary. Attenborough foregrounds how urban structures open up new opportunities for animals' predation, sexual competition, and social interactions. Shots of langurs jumping elegantly from roof to roof, as you can see here, birds of prey swooping past skyscrapers, and macaques deftly using alleyways to escape from the market where they have just stolen fruit, foreground a different perception and use of urban infrastructures. Only very occasionally does Attenborough focus on the dangers of cityscapes. For example, in one scene, he foregrounds the light pollution that leads turtle hatchlings away from the ocean and toward roads where most of them are run over. But his main emphasis lies on the way in which animals move about and use infrastructures that seem primarily designed for humans. And so the contemporary city actually emerges as a multi-species habitat. Such considerations of how animals co-inhabit the city with humans and how their presence and well-being might be enhanced have formed part of urban revitalization and urban greening projects since the 1990s. And obviously, the cleanup of urban air, waterways, and soils benefits both humans and non-humans. So does the creation of additional green spaces, whether they're parks, community gardens, or green rooftops, especially when they're planted with the kind of vegetation that most fosters the local ecology. And this is also an interesting development in the opinion of an increasing number of especially younger biologists and ecologists, these don't always have to be native species. Some native species are actually not well adapted to urban heat, shade, and water conditions. But this vegetation is particularly useful when it's not purely ornamental species. That was a mistake that I think was often made in the past, but when they're also designed to serve as food and habitat for insects, reptiles, and birds. New developments in biological and ecological science that have accompanied the really explosive growth of urban ecology over the last 20 years have contributed to the emergence of these new narratives. And these narratives emphasize both how many species co-inhabit the city with humans and what could be done to encourage their presence. Cities until the turn of the millennium were understudied in urban ecology, in part because of what I mentioned earlier, because they were perceived as uninteresting for biodiversity research. But practical barriers also played an important role. So a great deal of urban land is divided up into relatively small parcels and is privately owned by homeowners, businesses, and organizations. And so it's extraordinarily difficult for scientists to study these habitats. They just don't have access. And so this is where things also have changed. The rise of digitally supported citizen or community science, as it's sometimes called, where by individuals, spot sightings, post sightings of species on internet databases like eBird or iNaturalist.org, and there are many others, have enabled entirely new kinds of research. Biologists have increasingly come to value these databases because whatever biases they have are to some extent counteracted by the sheer number of data that they produce, numbers that were unattainable in earlier scientific research on urban animals, which it should be admitted came also with its own set of preferences and biases. And they provide a glimpse of what is actually going on in these privately owned urban spaces that scientists typically have no access to, or where it's very difficult because you'd have to get permission from thousands of different individual owners. So for example, Greg Pauly, a herpetologist at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, was not only able to develop far more detailed maps of the distribution of lizard species across Los Angeles County with his collaborators through the help of iNaturalist, but even on the basis of the photos that are a mandatory part of postings on iNaturalist, he was able to determine the incidence of mites on these lizards in the more or less urbanized parts of the county. It's totally amazing. I mean, he just analyzed these hundreds of photos and just counted the mites that show up on the faces of the lizards, and then was able to make a map of where they have more mites and where they have fewer mites, and there's a pattern to it. In the same vein, an insect study that was carried out by the same Natural History Museum from 2012 to 15 found not just dozens of insects that were not known to inhabit the county of Los Angeles before, but actually 30 species of flies that were previously unknown to science. And the analysis is still ongoing. I mean, the last publication was in 2018, so it's quite possible that there will be more species identified. And from 2015 on, they expanded it from insects to reptiles and amphibians, snails and slugs, and also squirrels. And these parts relied purely on community science. Going beyond attention to and more accurate accounting of urban animal species, some construction projects specifically target them. So here in my hometown, for example, mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains are geographically and genetically boxed in by freeways, which only few of them succeed in crossing without being killed or so seriously injured that they need to be euthanized. On the picture here, you see P22, who's a celebrity in LA because he actually managed to cross 2 major freeways and ended up alive in Griffith Park in the middle of Los Angeles, where he continues to live today, but isolated from other mountain lions. Wildlife conservation organizations are now close to raising the $50 million necessary to build a freeway overpass that would open up this habitat, not just for mountain lions, but also a whole range of other animals like deer, raccoons, skunks, possums, bobcats, and coyotes. Now, these are less endangered, but they also, of course, fall prey to car traffic. The American biologist Timothy Beatley has elaborated on this kind of thinking to advocate for biophilic design. He takes into account not just the benefits of urban nature for humans, which many other ecologists and social psychologists have highlighted. And while earlier versions of biophilic design had taken natural structures and processes as models for buildings that would be more functional, more aesthetically pleasing, and healthier for humans, Beatley focuses on urban infrastructure and design that also take the needs of non-humans seriously. And that's particularly clear in his most recent book, The Bird-Friendly City, Creating Safe Urban Habitats, which came out last year. So here he explores how cities can be made safer for migrating birds, who are killed annually by the hundreds of thousands through collisions with highly reflective window fronts. So what Beatley does in that book is explore architectural examples such as the Mira building in San Francisco or the Interface building in Atlanta, whose surfaces were designed with the express purpose of avoiding these vast expanses of glass that are simply invisible to birds in flight. And the owners of the Interface building, that's why I put that quote on there, actually explicitly invoke biophilic design in their building philosophy. But Beatley isn't just focused on buildings. He also emphasizes the importance of laws, building codes, and ordinances that make these accommodations mandatory rather than just a luxury addendum to some architectural vanity projects. He also foregrounds other kinds of regulations that limit the use of pesticides and herbicides, which often wreak havoc on animal species far beyond the so-called pests at whom they were originally aimed. And he also discusses completely different kinds of technology, like rainbow collars or collar bibs that keep roaming cats from killing birds. I'm very interested in this issue of free roaming cats in cities. I don't have time to discuss it in my talk, but we can return to it in the discussion. Here, I simply want to highlight that over the last 3 decades, new narratives in planning, architecture, and design approach the city as a space that is inhabited by many species other than humans, that these species benefit human health and well-being, and that their presence should therefore be made known, that it should be studied, encouraged, and protected. So in some sense, they continue an anthropocentric focus, but some of these narratives, like Beatley's, seek to create multifunctional urban spaces and infrastructures that serve both humans and non-humans, and even in a few cases, primarily non-humans, like that overpass. Other narratives go a step further to highlight how non-human species have a right to life, habitat, and survival in the urban realm, and I'd like now to turn to these. New developments in biology have helped that reconsideration of urban animals, even though they don't come out of animal rights necessarily. So you could broadly say that over the last 30 years, we've gone from thinking about nature in cities, that is thinking about the parks and rivers and lakes and green spaces that contain biodiversity, to nature for the city, that is how we can increase the total number and equitable access to green and blue spaces. And from there, we're now going to the city as nature, a more fundamental rethinking of urban environments as ecosystems of their own. Different from other kinds of ecosystems, to be sure, with distinctive properties like the heat island effect, distinctive types of fauna and flora, and completely different water regimes than surrounding ecosystems. And this is an approach that casts the city as a novel ecosystem. Now, this term, novel ecosystem, comes from the Australian ecologist Richard Hobbs and his collaborators. And what they meant by that term primarily is ecosystems that have been altered by humans, but then abandoned and left to their own ecological development again. So, they're really interested in abandoned mines, in forests that have been logged, but then left to regrow, and so forth, and the way in which these ecosystems then undergo ecological change that does not bring them back to their former state, but really to a totally new state. That's what they mean by novel ecosystems. And clearly, you might say, this is not what cities are. Cities undergo constant human intervention and maintenance. But still, that term was adopted even by some of Hobbes' own collaborators in this first publication as a way of driving home the point that cities are ecosystems, but ecosystems that we do not understand very well as yet. And one implication of this approach is that cities and their biodiversity shouldn't be assessed only in terms of how they compare to the biodiversity of the surrounding and less humanly altered ecosystems, but by benchmarks of their own that are specifically derived from the urban context. And some of you might have heard of the Singapore Biodiversity Index, which is now commonly used for cities around the world. Parallel perspectives had emerged in geography and political science even before Hobbes's phrase was coined. The geographer Jennifer Walsh has most forcefully argued that contemporary urban theory should integrate the impacts of urban growth on non-urban wildlife, that is what happens to the animals around the city, and on the ecologies of animal life in the city itself. Beyond concrete issues of wildlife conservation, she argues, trans-species urban theory, or Zoöpolis as she calls it, also offers the possibility of new alliances between different branches of environmental activism. So she says in one of her publications, Zoöpolis invites a critique of contemporary urbanization from the standpoint of animals, but also from the perspective of people who, together with animals, suffer from urban pollution and habitat degradation, and who are denied the experience of animal kinship and otherness so vital to their well-being. Now, once she starts to reconsider cities as inhabited by more than just one species that might have rights to the space and its resources, that leads ultimately to questions of ethics and justice. So in another publication, she says, we have just begun to think about the moral choices we make in building and living in cities and what they mean for animals. If animals are granted subjectivity, agency, and even maybe culture, how do we determine their survival in the city? If urban and environmental justice is eventually broadened to include animal justice as well, questions also arise about how radical an urban democracy we can visualize or handle in practice. So based on Walsh's concept of trans-species urban theory and also the work of multi-species ethnographers that has grown explosively over the last 10 years, I proposed the notion of multi-species justice in the book that Sadiah mentioned, Imagining Extinction. So what I try to do with the term multi-species justice is to think together, on one hand, the concerns of the environmental justice movement with unequal exposure to environmental risks and unequal access to environmental benefits. And on the other hand, animal rights concerns for non-humans' claim on our moral consideration. A lot of conservation debates, which I talk about in the book, as well as a great number of decisions in urban and regional planning, fundamentally involve questions about what it is right to do by other people and what it is right to do or not by other species, and what group or institution should resolve these kinds of questions. So to name a few examples, debate about whether you allocate urban space to parks or housing, how you distribute water so as to ensure supplies for urban communities, but also to sustain urban vegetation, how you adjudicate between human cultural preferences for certain kinds of gardenscapes and non-humans' needs for plant habitat, when and how you use pesticides, or how you weigh the rights of cats and those of songbirds, just for example, are not just pragmatic questions, but they also involve underlying issues of justice. Now, given that definitions and foundations of thinking about justice themselves differ between communities, it becomes all the more important which communities are represented, how and by whom in that context. So these questions of what constitutes justice and who participates in defining its meanings and implementations emerge every time that cities have to make decisions about either competing human and non-human communities or competing needs of different non-human species. Some fictional narrative have staged these kinds of conflicts over justice in ways that I think make the stakes and the possible outcomes even clearer than documentary accounts can. I'm thinking here of a novel like China Miéville's speculative fiction Perdido Street Station from 2000, which is set in the fictional city of Nukrobuzan. Now that's a city of many real and imaginary species that is part Dickensian London with a dash of steampunk and part alien planet with a profusion of different intelligent species. Varied human and non-human perspectives and projects clash and converge in the struggle for survival against a deadly invasive species in a metropolis that is bleakly dystopian on one hand, and yet exuberantly vital in another dimension, and a plot that takes fantastic, horrific, and Baroque turns. Miéville characterizes Nukrobuzan as a mongrel city, and that phrase accretes a number of different meanings over the course of the plot. It refers on one level to the immigrants, the refugees, the outsiders who remake Nukrobuzan every day, this place with a bastard culture. But the character who thinks that, Yagarek, is himself not human. He's a Garuda, member of a 6-foot-tall species of intelligent birds, and only one of many sentient species that populate New Crobuzon. So there's humans, obviously. There's Khepri, a matriarchal species whose females have human-like bodies and heads in the shape of a scarab, while the males are simply unintelligent beetles. Vodyanoi, a large frog-like species. Hochi, vaguely hedgehog-like creatures, and Cactusae, which are essentially walking, talking, and thinking cacti. And for this slide, I've drawn on the internet manifested imagination of readers of Perdido Street Station who have created these illustrations that don't form part of the novel itself, but the novel describes these species in great detail. And so illustrators have gone ahead and made these wonderful visual illustrations of what these different species look like. These species here on the slide are among many others whose material needs and cultural communities shape the particular character of individual neighborhoods, as well as the multi-species character of the overall city. And some of these species, as you can see, combine human and non-human physical characteristics. The city is hybrid in many other respects too. The hybridization and cyborgization of human bodies with parts from other species and with mechanical parts is a highly advanced technology. And knowledge is similarly hybrid. The scientist on whom two of the major plot lines converge, Isaac Dender Grimnebulin, who's represented here on the slide in the middle, defines his expertise as a combination of disciplines. So his main research interest is how the energy that crisis mobilizes in individual bodies and in collectives might be materialized and used. And over the course of the novel, he's called upon to deploy his knowledge about crisis energy to solve two different problems. So one of these involves Yagarek, whose wings have been amputated as punishment for a rape he has committed. So he travels from his faraway home community in the desert to seek out Grimnebulin's help in restoring him to flight. So it's a medical project, but also a project of biological restoration in a sense. The other one is a problem of biological invasion. As Grimnebulin researches flight mechanisms in a variety of species, he accidentally releases a member of an intelligent species from another continent, a so-called slake moth, that is able to hypnotize other sentient beings into submission and nourishes itself from consuming their minds, leaving them alive, but deprived of sentience and unable to care for themselves, essentially turns them into zombies, right? This moth frees 4 other members of its species from a research lab, and with no natural predators or effective defense weapons that might defeat them, the moth group turns into a deadly urban danger that Grimnebulin has to help combat. So Mieville, if you know any of his writings, you know that he's primarily interested in the social and political life of cities rather than in urban nature. And that overriding interest justifies reading the species variety and these themes of biological restoration and ecological invasion in Perdido Street Station as political allegories. But the extravagant detail with which Mieville describes the biological and material realities of organic and urban structures in his novel far exceeds the needs of political allegory and calls for a more ecological reading. And from that perspective, the profusion of imaginary species in Mieville's Metropolis is not just an allegory of sociocultural and economic diversity, but a portrait of the more real, but often unimagined biodiversity of actually existing cities. By the same token, the meticulously described neighborhoods that are dominated by one particular species can be read as acknowledgments that urban space is not shaped by one species alone. And the fact that Mieville has to rely on the genres, or does rely on the genres of science fiction, horror, and fantasy to portray non-human individuals and communities with sentience, social structure, culture, politics, crafts, and their own aesthetic values highlights in and of itself how far removed from our usual sense of urban reality such a perception of other species, city species is, but also how it might change our knowledge of and understanding of real urban spaces. That changed understanding may at first sight be most obviously reflected in the cross-species relationships of love, friendship, and collaboration that the novel portrays. Grimnebulin has a love affair of several years standing with the Khepri artist Lynn. He forms bonds of respect and friendship with the Garuda Yagarek, and he puts together alliances to fight the slake moths that involve multiple factions of humans and non-humans. But here a question arises: why are the slake moths ultimately excluded from this encompassing and enormously diverse system of relationships. The urgent need to exterminate a non-native predatory species that doesn't have any natural enemies to keep it in check is a familiar motif from invasion ecology, and that does explain one turn of the plot that is not well explained in terms of political allegory. So the critic Christopher Palmer has pointed out that the culminating battles in Perdido Street Station eliminate the immediate danger for the city, and they demonstrate the collaborative mechanisms that are necessary for a successful political revolution. So you could say, okay, that's Mieville, he's a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. This is his way of representing political revolution. But the outcome is to leave the city in the same state in which it started out, functional, but heavily unequal, corrupt, and oppressive. The moment of revolution, in other words, perpetuates the status quo rather than introducing a new order. That doesn't really make sense in terms of political allegory, but it does in ecological terms. The extermination of invasive species is most often meant to return the ecosystem to its pre-invasive status. But it remains, and it has kept bothering me about this novel, that the violent killing of the slate moths doesn't sync well with Mieville's exuberant descriptions of the multi-species city and the narrative vocabulary of Gothic horror that is associated with these gigantic black moths that turn other beings into zombies only makes that problem worse. Portrayals of some sentient beings as inherently evil and destructive are just not easy to compatibilize with either political or ecological thinking, both of which would relativize these kinds of moral judgments in relation to divergent cultural standards and ecological networks. Now, you can go ahead and blame that on a shortfall of Mieville's imagination, or on the more general problem of narrativizing sociopolitical problems with biological metaphors. But I think a look at the other important plotline in Perdido Street Station, the story of Yagarek's crime and sentence, sheds light on that problem in a different way. Now, Yagarek clearly suffers from the loss of his ability to fly. Being earthbound amounts to what he perceives as a fundamental demotion in his social and ontological status. Grimnebulin is both moved by his client's despair and intrigued by the technical problems of making a larger-than-human bird who has lost his wings regain flight. But Grimnebulin changes his mind after a visit from Karuchai, the female Garuda whom Yagarek has raped, in a serious violation of the communitarian respect for others' choices that the Garuda conceive of as the backbone of their society. So the Garuda community, it emerges, is actually a kind of socialist utopia of sorts, in which the well-being of others and of the community as a whole supersedes individualism. Karuchai pleads with Grimnebulin not to reverse the Garuda justice system and its judgment on Yagarek, so his wings were amputated as punishment for the rape. And Grimnebulin, after long deliberation, accepts this entreaty and abandons the quest to restore Yagarek's ability to fly. Yagarek, in turn, after a lot of agonizing and anger at Grimnebulin, accepts the terminal loss of his avian capabilities, and he himself removes all of his remaining feathers and re-enters New Crobuzon as a more human-like, unfeathered creature, but who still has a beak, and begins an entirely new life. So that plotline approximates, allegorically speaking, the ethics that might inform urban multi-species justice. Grimnebulin is portrayed as both sympathetic to the plight of a non-human creature, whom he comes to accept as a friend and a comrade in arms. At the same time, he is in the end respectful of the cultural and ethical norms that govern a non-human society he only understands incompletely. Yagarek emerges as a subject who has to abandon his original identity and adopt a new, unprecedented one, a non-flighted, unfeathered Garuda, but one whose active acceptance of his new identity comes with the hope that remains associated with hybridity and transition throughout the novel. So what I'm saying here is Mieville structures the architecture of his urban novel so as to oppose two divergent plot lines that involve multi-species justice. One, Yagarek's sentence, search for redemption and acceptance of his judgment, shows different ideas of what constitutes justice and how they are accepted and accommodated by the different species involved. And the second one, the slate moth's introduction into the city, their persecution and extermination, shows a line in which a non-native species is portrayed as a lethal danger that justly has to be and is eliminated in the end. Perdido Street Station doesn't minimize or sentimentalize the costs of either decision. And I think that is actually a large part of what makes it dystopian, or makes it feel dystopian to us, because in the end, it's actually, the danger is eliminated, right? The city is saved. But Yagarek, with his feathers ripped away from most of his body, scarred and unflighted, appears at the end of the novel as an echo of the humans who were remade with animal parts as part of a judicial punishment. Grimnebulon and his closest friends leave New Crobuzon, and Lynn, Grimnebulon's Khepri lover, is reduced to a state of permanent infantilism after a slate moth has robbed her of part of her mind. So it's a really, really melancholy ending, and multi-species justice does not, in Mervel's portrayal, offer easy solutions or even difficult ones that come without a significant moral and material cost. And that's why I'm really interested in this novel, that in spite of its completely fantastical setting, it actually approaches in a very realistic way the costs and the incredibly difficult decisions that you confront in implementing multi-species justice in the city and without. But ecological invasion and hybridity in the real world can also lead to more life-affirming outcomes than the ones that Mervel portrays. As Sadiah mentioned, the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies, LENS, at UCLA, 3 years ago collaborated with the public television station KCET to produce several packages of environmental web content that included in each case a short documentary and several essays by faculty and graduate students. The one that I wrote and produced is called Urban Ark Los Angeles, and it deals with a kind of parrot, red-crowned Amazons, that are common in Pasadena and the San Gabriel Valley of East Los Angeles. These parrots are the descendants of escaped pet parrots that were poached in northeastern Mexico by the tens of thousands in the 1970s and 80s and taken to the US. The practice was then outlawed in the early 90s. That didn't completely stop it, but it made it more convenient to breed these birds domestically. They're now endangered in their original habitat in Tamaulipas, with a remaining population of under 10,000, possibly even below 5,000, hard to come by very precise numbers. The population in Los Angeles is 2,000 or 3,000 strong and thriving. So it's actually now an important part of what remains of this endangered species. So in this case, an introduced and now endangered species has found sanctuary in a major metropolis without humans planning for it or managing it. Examples like this one have led a biologist colleague at UCLA, Bradley Schaefer, to argue that what happened in this case spontaneously could become an opportunity for planned urban conservation. And so I'm going to play you just 1 minute from Urban Ark Los Angeles.
We create all these different habitats in urban centers. We create vertical walled cliffs. We happen to call them office buildings. We create vast expanses of rock outcrops. We call them sidewalks. Those are habitats that wouldn't naturally be here, but we've created them. So then the question is, what goes into these created habitats that are unnatural for this part of the state, but where a lot of different species could make it there? And the way it normally works is it's just luck. Somebody lets something go, something shows up, and we have suddenly a bunch of non-native individuals living in that habitat. I think we can do better than that, and I think we should do better than that, and we should in fact manage which species show up in our non-native habitats, and we should pick ones that we want to have here. We create all these...
So while Schaefer and myself continue to believe that it makes sense to protect, foster, and reintroduce native species when the environment is appropriate, we also think that the city offers many new ecological niches that we might use for conservation of species that are not native. What should occupy these niches is in part a biological discussion, but also, and above all, a cultural one. What species do different communities want to see around, which ones not, and why? What future city do we envision that we'd like to work toward? How do we involve as many voices and perspectives as possible in that discussion? That is, I think, what a focus on urban multi-species justice can deliver as we work towards Zoöpolis. Not easy answers to complex decisions about urban animals, but a shift of that decision-making from biological to cultural grounds. So to conclude, I've tried to outline here how narratives about animals and more generally biodiversity in cities have been completely transformed over the last 30 years. Narratives of loss and absence continue to circulate that focus on the species displaced by urban structures and those that are put at risk in them. But other narratives have emerged that revolve around greening, restoration, multi-species justice, Zoöpolis, Biopolis, and biological evolution in the city. These stories paint a very different picture of animals in the city, one that I think opens up promising possibilities in the general panorama of biodiversity loss. Thank you.